I'd like to introduce myself now. I'm Mary Liz Stewart.
And Paul Stewart.
We are.
This is our stereo thing.
Surround sound.
We are co-founders of what today is called Underground Railroad Education Center. It grew out of a personal research project that began back in the late 1990s when I was in a fifth grade classroom, and was trying to figure out a way to help my very tangible 10-year-old thinkers come to understand that the Underground Railroad was not about subways nor about above-ground trains. So my thought was, if I could take documented accounts of real live people into the classroom, it might be a helpful strategy for helping my students understand this period in American history. And Paul, very quickly.
I was doing community work, social service work, but in my side moments, I was writing for a local community newspaper doing local Black history. And so I was always looking for new things around which to build a story, to build articles.
Before we
We put our energies together. That's how we.
Before we jump in, a couple of things. One is, I hope you all brought your roller skates. This is going to be a really fast excursion. We really are only able to skim the surface with the time we have, but we hope that it provides you with some thought-provoking ideas that will lead you to further research, further conversations, further digging into this important piece of the American narrative. I'm also going to ask if I could have a couple of timekeepers in this room. My watch says 10 minutes after. I believe we're done at 11:45.
11:50.
11:50. Oh, another 5 minutes. Okay. What I'd like to ask is if someone could give us a high sign at 11:30, and then at 11:40.
I got you.
Okay, so thank you, appreciate that. Let's see, there was something, oh, I know, the other thing I want to mention is we are standing here assuming that all of you have some familiarity with the standard retelling of Underground Railroad history. So with that assumption in place, we're going to jump in and utilize our time as profitably as we can for all of us. But at the same time, I want to be sure and leave time at the end for questions, thoughts, observations, comments of any kind. So shall we forge ahead? There we go. Too many. Do you want to do the keyboard? Oh, okay. All right.
It's a new device for me.
After Paul and I spent a considerable amount of time with this personal research project, which after a few years morphed into something far more public, we decided that our initial concepts that were informing our research needed to be revised. And we eventually arrived at a point where these 8 concepts have come to frame how we interpret Underground Railroad history. Do you want to first add?
Yeah, and one of the things that had been very common in the past is to say things like, well, there's no documentation about the Underground Railroad, there's no information, therefore you can't, it's all secret, you can't find it. And we found quite the contrary. There is actually, to make a long story short, the point of view is that it's a lot of times people look at it and say, well, is it half empty or is it half full? Is the information there or is it not? And we're concentrating on the half full part rather than a glass of water half empty. So document based, that there are real documents that you can go to that will elaborate the story and articulate the story for you. The real stories are better than the myths. More interesting. It has a public side, that it's more than just a string of safe houses that people who were enslaved used to get to the North End freedom.
The role of African Americans in leadership positions was very significant in this movement. So often in the standard retelling, Black Americans who have been enslaved are relegated to, well, Black Americans generally are relegated to a position of enslavement, or if they are acknowledged to have been free, it's frequently, the association is they didn't have much or they were poor. And for us, in our research, it's quite clear that there's far more to the story than that tells. That this really is, Underground Railroad activity is really about civil disobedience, and the language that we use to speak about this history among ourselves and to share it with generations to follow, we make the statement needs to be revised because the standard language that I'm sure you have experienced and in many places is still being used, is language that comes from a particular perspective and gives validity to a certain aspect of this story. And finally, there is very definitely, there are lines of connection of this history with us today.
This is one of our favorite documents. This is a letter from Harriet Myers that was written to William John Jay, and you're going to...
Yes. What we'd like to share this as one example of the richness of primary documentation. This particular letter, and again, there's so much more we could say about it, but to focus in on the content of this letter, it was written in Albany, August 20th, 1860, from the Anti-Slavery Office at number 10, Lark Street. Mr. William J. Esquire, Sir. The 2 fugitives arrived here that you sent, and I sent them immediately on their route for Canada. In this month, we have had 10. We have sent on the 2 that you sent, sir. They had some money. They said that you gave them some. They had enough to get to Canada, but the other had none. Mr. Myers is not home. He is at Lake George this season as a butler. And you see, sir, I have to attend to the fugitives myself. I was very thankful that you gave some aid, for it was on Saturday they came, and it would have been difficult to get money to send them on that day. And it is hard to get money for the fugitives, for it seems that the prejudice against our class grows stronger every day. And yet, we have a few good friends that feel for the bleeding slave that comes panting at their doors. I thank you for all the favors you have done for the downtrodden that come to this office. May God bless you and your posterity. Yours for the oppressed, Harriet Myers. Observations?
No.
Thoughts? Would you?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, it's a primary source material. I mean, how did you find it? Who found it?
I think we were first tipped off to it. It's actually housed, the original's housed in Katona at the J Homestead. I think we were originally tipped off to it, as I recall, from Fergus Bordewick, who was researching considerably, finally published a book.
The Underground Railroad War for the Soul of America.
Yeah, a rather voluminous tome, but very, very rich documentation that unearthed, a lot of historic documentation related to this period in American history that had not made its way into the public arena. So it was, he encountered it, he tipped us off, so we went down there, and the archivist who was there was incredibly helpful in both locating for us and sharing this with us. So yeah, anything else about
You want me to comment?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I'm with the Lake George Historical Association, and we have this letter on exhibit to show what's going on in regards to the Underground Railroad in Lake George.
Yeah. What was the name of the organization again that she referenced in the letter?
The
Organization?
She said.
The Vigilance Committee Office, you mean? The
In the first sentence, I can't read it from here. But
there's the Anti-Slavery Office.
Yes.
Is that what you, okay.
Yeah.
That was at number 10 Lark Street. Other thoughts?
There's great agency, which you were talking about, I love the agency before, both for Harriet as a person of color and a woman at the time.
Yes.
She seems like she's running the entire office. While
She is.
Her husband is
Well, yeah,
George, so.
when Stephen's at Lake George, he's gone for the season.
Yeah.
So she's the one opening the front door. She's the one welcoming the freedom seekers into her home, clearly breaking protocol for the day in terms of what was considered proper for women's behavior. She's the one who's going out, after she interviews the freedom seekers, she's the one who's on for going out to obtain the resources these folks needed. Clearly a woman, as you say, definitely exerting agency here, and very much, wait a second, for us, this becomes a really rich treasure trove because we have found, I think you referenced it, and you may have referenced it, something you were saying made me think of this letter, how the, invisibility, how the documenting of women's involvement in this movement is pretty thin. And we might know these women gathered by this name and this name for the, this particular Lundy or Lovejoy Society meeting, but what they actually did is really difficult. And I'm going to go to the back and then come up. Yes.
She writes beautifully. She's very well educated. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that?
We don't have, well, go
Yeah,
ahead.
we don't have a lot of information about how she got her education, but we do know that she had a reputation as being a bright shining star vis-a-vis what was going on. I remember from her obituary, it specifically mentions she read books and she read men too. And there are other comments that are there about how she was well studied and also did literary work.
Yes, oh, I'm sorry, I'll come up here and then I'll go back there.
I'm curious, one of the things we found when we're doing our Women in the American Story research is people will say, oh, women are not well documented. But what they actually mean is in the secondary sources. Like if you
Right.
go to the archives, it's all there, just
Yeah,
nobody's cataloged
Yeah.
it or talked about it. Is the same true with this history?
Well, go ahead. I'm gonna say to some degree, yes, but
Yeah.
some degree.
Yeah.
It's just-
I think that is probably a truism for a lot of different things.
Yeah.
There's a book that I read about the Underground Railroad in Chester, Pennsylvania, and surrounding communities. It's a story of maybe about 8 different families, white families, that were living on the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and how they facilitated the Underground Railroad. But in almost every one of those stories, where they send people from one family to the next family, there are black people involved. And they say that in the book, but they don't play it up. You know?
So, yes,
As a teaching tool, the date is 1860.
Yes.
Right? So the part where she talks about the prejudice against our class grows
Stronger every day.
stronger every day. That could be a good way to help students contextualize, or dispel mythologies that slavery was waning and influenced
Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
that prejudice didn't
Sure.
exist in the North. I
exactly.
think those things contextually play out as firsthand.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing, I'm pointing at Paul, because when we host tour experiences at the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, Paul frequently will reference your
Oh, yeah, I have-
timeline for
Yeah, there's the whole
1850s,
block for that
1850s.
decade,
Yeah.
which gets progressively worse, starting from the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law till right up to the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and then of course the aftermath of that,
Yeah.
which is important here. But
I was gonna say if we had time, but yeah, we should
Yeah.
move on. Again, just respecting time. Yes,
I just want to, one of the things that we were told that we don't find a lot of first sources in Shenango County is because of the fugitive slave law, and by putting these in writing, they could, it would prove that these folks were breaking the law, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And so I'm appreciative that out there somewhere we'll find
Yeah.
something like this in our world.
I apologize for making a face, but that has inhibited a lot of research effort. And one of the concepts, if we go to the next one, maybe one of the initial concepts was that there is a public side. And public side, oftentimes we find people say, oh my gosh, wasn't that, as you see names on this flyer, which we'll reference in just a moment, wasn't that dangerous? Well, yes, it was. But people who are resisting, who are engaging in civil disobedience, are going to take those risks to stand up and present themselves publicly. Now, there are choices that are made, yes over here, no over there, but it doesn't mean that carte blanche, all these resistors are going into hiding. And so those public documents they were there and are still there for us. So don't let them go.
Yes, this is another favorite public document of ours. This is a flyer. We actually have this flyer on a big poster sitting in the front room of the Myers residence, where we invite people in to sit in the parlor, sit in the space where the meeting that's described here took place, and where these Vigilance Committee members gathered. So this flyer, for those of you in the back, it says Vigilance Committee Office, 198 Lumber Street. Lumber Street was renamed Livingston Avenue after the Civil War. The number shifted a little bit, but we
Just
look at that.
Technology.
That's cool.
No.
Never works to be.
All right, what are we doing here?
Maybe just
Number 5.
double tap it on the screen.
Double tap on the screen.
There you go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So we found this building, and to make a long story short, we found our way to this building, and the building was in horrible shape, and we're working on restoring it. It looks the way it does now because it looked like 10 times worse before. Chimneys were gone, gutters, at any rate, it's a long time ago. So this is a great flyer. We call on our fellow citizens here and elsewhere to aid us Aid us in funds to help the poor and fortunate fugitives who come to us daily, destitute of clothing, weary of travel, and hungry. No one is so poor as to be able to give a little to this downtrodden class.
This is a broadside.
Yeah, pamphlet.
A
You
flyer.
hand it out.
What do we do with flyers? What's the purpose?
Spread them out all over the
Spread
place.
them out, get the word out. That word was going out publicly, and you said you also located it in the Pine and Palm?
It was in the Pine and Palm newspaper, which is an abolitionist paper out of Boston. So they're obviously going to a wider audience to try to solicit help.
So again, we'll keep moving on because
Yeah.
the time won't stop. But, oh.
Not twice.
Go to 5.
Oh,
Would you look at that?
There we go, we're getting there.
Sorry about this.
There we go, okay.
Take away all the surprises.
But again, this is only one example. There are many more we could get into if we had more time, but evidence that there was a public side and to this activity. And of course, you all recognize these folks, the guy in the top and on the bottom. There we go, yes. Our position is, yes, they were memorable in this history, but they weren't the only ones. That there were all sorts of other people doing the kinds of things they were doing and doing other things as well that contributed to
Yeah.
the expansive efforts to eliminate the institution of enslavement in our country.
A very rich story, lots of people involved doing lots of different kinds of things. These are some African Americans from our region, with the exception of the little guy up there.
Quickly, I'll introduce. Top left, Dr. Thomas Elkins, a black doctor who lived and worked in the city of Albany. Coming down on the bottom, Moses Viney, a freedom seeker. Some of you may know him in relationship to his Schenectady story. Stephen Myers in the center, sitting on the chair, also a man born enslaved in New York State. Let's see, that's William Henry Johnson with the beard, a man born free in Virginia, chose to come to Albany to work with Stephen Myers on anti-slavery activities. James Beulah.
James Beulah.
James Beulah, the man with the top hat, also a freedom seeker who made his way with his wife and children to New York State. There's more to the story for all these people. Bottom right is Henry Highland Garnett. You may be familiar with him. He's very well known in terms of the Troy story. He too was born enslaved. Nathaniel Paul, a minister, he was a man born free. He was a minister in the city of Albany, engaged, is particularly noted for his fundraising efforts for refugee communities, particularly in Canada. Top right is Sarah Johnson, wife of William Henry Johnson with the whiskers. She was a friend and colleague of Harriet Myers. The little black print up there he's a white man, Abel Brown, who was a very cantankerous and opinionated sort of fellow, but he again was very active in Underground Railroad activism in the city of Albany. So quickly.
Yeah. So this is Stephen Myers, and I apologize for the pixelation here. Not a very good image, but he was born around 1795, maybe 1800. Manumitted in 1818. There's a great story there. Worked in as early as the 1830s as an anti-slavery activist, edited and organized a bunch of different newspapers, and was an agent for the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad. This is a favorite quote of ours. The Albany Committee of Vigilance, run by Stephen Myers, had the reputation of being the most efficient organization in the state of New York in the business of aiding the wayworn and weather-beaten refugee from slavery shambles. This is written by David Ruggles in the Liberator in 1844.
And we, at this point, I think I would very much like to give a shout out to our local public librarians. When Paul and I started our research, we thought 19 plus academic institutions in the capital region. This should be a piece of cake to locate information about local people. Well, we were very wrong. And so we turned our attention then to researched documents, to books that had been written by academic researchers, thinking, all right, at least we will have research, documented information to share with our respective audiences. Well, very nicely, as we were engaging in these, in this reading, lo and behold, there's a reference to this guy, Stephen Myers over here, and Lydia and Abigail Mott over here, and of course, as research materials do, they had footnotes and bibliographic references. So we gathered up the footnotes and bibliographic references that were relevant to us, went to our local public librarians and asked if they could tap into their network to bring resources to us. And to this day, we would not be where we are if our local public librarians had not accessed their network. This was in the days of microfilm. So, anyways, moving on.
Yeah, we don't have any images of Harriet Myers, but this is an image that a local artist painted representing Harriet Myers. She took the material that we provided her, the obituary, the letter, did some ruminating and thinking, and this is what she came up with. And you see the letter is the backdrop of this image. And did I do that again, right?
No, don't touch it.
And she's got under her arm a copy of the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate, where it reminds us in her obituary that the obituary that was done by William Henry Johnson in the Christian Recorder, which was an African Methodist Episcopal newsletter that she edited.
She
proofread the columns before they went to print
before Stephen Myers'
Before Stephen Myers'
articles went into
Yeah.
print. Yes.
So
But yeah, so we should move on because again, time is.
there's a bunch of other people we could talk about: Jermaine Logan, Austin Stewart from Rochester, John Jones. Whoops. Mr. Gibbs, Charles Redmond. These are all other people that were black activists around New York State that were important to the Underground Railroad.
And the list is far longer than this, but
Yeah.
nonetheless,
Yeah.
it offers an example. This particular image we'd like to offer for consideration in terms of this idea that the Underground Railroad is better understood as a movement. When you think of a movement, Black Lives Matter movement, women's movements, labor movement, anything at all, what comes to mind? What do people do when they're engaged in a movement?
Protest.
They protest. What else do they do? Gather together. What do they do when they gather? Okay.
Eat.
Sorry?
They eat.
They eat, yes.
Yeah.
They sing songs.
They what?
They sing
They
songs.
plan. They sing songs. What else? Anything else?
Look to the future, look to the past.
Okay. Do they produce literature
Okay.
in various forms? Is there public speaking that goes on? Absolutely. Are there people who think, that changing laws is the way to go? We found in our research that these elements exist within the Underground Railroad. Now, I think calling this the Underground Railroad in some ways does a disservice to this history. Some people would prefer to identify it as, the abolition movement, others as anti-slavery. We still, in this country, cling to Underground Railroad. So, being that as it may. James Burney on the top left represents those people who chose the political system to work through to eliminate the institution of slavery. So we end up with the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, the Republican Party of the day. Bottom left is an image of Harriet Jacobs representing those individuals who put pen to paper in the form of narratives, in the form of other kinds of literature and broadsides, in the form of newspapers, of which there were many, many, many produced, abolition newspapers. The bottom right, who's the guy in the bottom right? John Brown, all right. I ask that because very often John Brown images, at least in the past, had always been this guy, this fiery guy with hair sticking out. This is a very modest image, but he represents those people. He's also a very acceptable image, I will say in just a moment why. He represents those people who were of an immediatist mindset. The institution of slavery needed to be abolished yesterday, and the way we do that is aggressively taking up arms. If you dig further into the history, though, it becomes quite clear. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, three black men who possessed the same desire as John Brown for this immediate elimination of this institution. So there's that aspect. Someone mentioned music. There is a body of music. In fact, there was a local Albany musician by the name of George Washington Clark. He was a musician in his own right, and he very nicely collected music of this movement, and the Rare Books and Manuscripts Division here at New York State Library has as an original copy of the approximately 300 songs that were collected. And these are songs, some of which were borrowed from enslaved people who were enslaved. Other songs are used so that melodies of the day are retained. People know the melodies, but the lyrics were changed. So a very patriotic song that many of you, maybe all of you know, "My country 'tis the sweet land of liberty, for thee I sing." That melody was retained, but the words were changed.
Yeah, she's looking at me because we're gonna sing it for you now.
Ready? If you sing, you might know this. Join us. You know it. Join us. You ready?
My country 'tis for the dark land of slavery, for thee I weep. Land where the slave has sighed, and where he's toiled and died to serve a tyrant's pride, for thee I weep.
And it goes on from there for another 4 verses. There are also songs in this collection that tear at your heartstrings, because they're songs about mothers watching their children being sold off, and songs about children watching their family members sold off in awful gangs. And there are also those rallying songs that want to, the kind of rallying songs that are supposed to motivate you to become part of this cause. So it's a large collection, but it's a very rich collection, and particularly speaks to those adults or children who have a particularly strong musical intelligence and are engaged much more effectively through that method.
There are lots of churches that were involved. We probably could go into great detail. These images here, this one I want to point out. For the purpose of the presentation, we're showing you a picture that includes the African Baptist Church here in the city of Albany. This is a picture from 1866, so time period wise it's like a little later, but this is the building. And
the building was standing
And the building was standing.
as early as the 1840s.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
What's fun here is that this is a gathering and a colored men's convention of 1866, in October of 1866 here in Albany. And there's a bunch of people sitting in the front row here. And I think that this is Stephen Myers, this is Adam Blake, this is Jermaine Logan, and this is Harriet Tubman. That's my call. I'd love to have somebody else take a look at that. Anyway, moving on.
But nonetheless, churches,
Yeah.
we found though that actually churches as historic repositories are very challenging to deal with, because their record-keeping strategies are not always the most useful. So,
In terms of the flow of traffic, people always want to look at maps. Maps are good and they're bad. They're good because they present material. They're bad because they're static sometimes, and things that happen over large periods of time get chunked into a static image. But this is a good image of the traffic of the Underground Railroad. What's not here is the fact that there are people escaping to the territories, and also that there were people escaping across the ocean. And I do want to point out the people escaping to the Caribbean and to Mexico, 2 important stories that are just unfolding nowadays, scholarship-wise.
I really put out blessings.
Yeah.
This I have to say really comes out of my teacher's hat. Language, I realized as we continued both when we started, as we continued our research, the power of language was very significant. And we started thinking about, well, this language that's part of the standard retelling, which are the words on the left, slave, fugitive, or runaway, master, owner, slavery, standard parts of the standard canon. We started to look at those and say, they speak to us from a particular perspective. We need to look at this language. And so in the process of going through, rather lengthy sort of personal reflection, we decided that rather than identifying individuals as slaves with the belief that nobody is born a slave, everybody is born a human being. A person becomes enslaved by virtue of being put into a condition of bondage. And so we thought it was not only more respectful, but more appropriate to identify people as enslaved. And that's only that, and as well, our effort has also been to try to reclaim the stories and voices of people who have been enslaved, so that they are more than just a category, but also individuals with stories. Instead of fugitive, and again, if we had more time, we could process this together, but fugitive oftentimes is associated with negatives, being a criminal, breaking laws, bad person. And the reality is people were fugitives by laws of the day, but it was to make a choice for self-agency, self-determination, the freedom that was promised in the Declaration of Independence. So identifying individuals as freedom seeker, we felt became more appropriate. Thank you. Some people have chosen self-emancipating, so that's another alternative. Master and owner, let's be honest, these people were enslavers, plain and simple. They were masters and owners by virtue of the hierarchical laws of the day, but they were enslavers. And when we talk about slavery, again, when we started our research, that word just kind of rolled off the tongue, was something we were familiar with, only to realize after a while that slavery really is an institution with legal supports, political supports, social supports, and economic supports. So it's like the legs of an institution that not only allow it to take root, but to grow and expand. So we offer that for consideration as you move forward.
We love to connect the story of the past to the present, and there are lots of different ways to go about doing that. One of those, all of these books, the books that are identified here, help us kind of see that. Slavery by another name by Doug Blackman, and of course the new Jim Crow, kind of relate to us about how more recent laws kind of followed in the tradition and footsteps of the process of enslavement. Doug Blackman points out how slavery was transformed after the Civil War, not that it was eliminated, but it was transformed, and we find it cropping up then within the Jim Crow period as arresting people for jaywalking, vagrancy, arresting black people for changing jobs, for any sort of thing, getting them into a jail, fining them when they couldn't pay the fine. Imagine being arrested for vagrancy and not being able to pay the fine, and then being sent off to a state penitentiary where they were then rented out to private employers, usually in industrial situations where the risks of death were very high. The Color of Law tells us about how segregation, how cities in the North and West were not segregated until after the 1920s, or in the 1920s and later, when segregationists who were brought into the federal government by Woodrow Wilson began to use federal policy to make cities segregate. This one here, Elizabeth Warren, when Senator Sessions was being nominated to be the Attorney General, she brought forward a letter which was effectively used against him during his Alabama Senate campaign. That was before he became a senator. Once he became a senator, he was kind of under a special set of rules. And the rules that senators live by is that they're not supposed to personally attack each other, etc. And so when Elizabeth Warren was crusading against him being nominated for the Attorney General, she went to read a letter from Coretta Scott King that had been effectively used against him in the Alabama Senate campaign. And one of the other senators, John Boehner, jumped up and said, she can't read that letter, Senate Rule 19. What was that Senate Rule 19? Well, Senate Rule 19 was a rule that had been adopted back during the gag rule period in the 1830s that set a tone for what could and couldn't be said. And so she did go on to read the letter, but that was just the idea that those things of the 1830s are still present and happening for us in this day.
We're going to move on very quickly. This slide, and the next one, can we go back to the previous one? These are examples of ways that we have worked to create opportunities for community members to engage with this history. It's based in Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So I will fess up and say I have become a firm believer in the value of his research. And so knowing that, we recognize that not everybody's going to come and sit at a lecture, and not everybody's going to come for a tour experience. So what we do is things like tabling. On the top right, bottom right is the annual public history conference that we've hosted, for 21 years, I think. Bottom left, we host an annual July 4th oration using Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the slave is your 4th of July?" and create a program framed by that particular very thought-provoking document and speech. Top left is an example of teen programs that we've been running now, I think 16 years or more. We move to the next one. That started out as a summer teen program, 100 hours. The teens would be with us. Now we've expanded to after school. We have engaged with community members in reclaiming blighted properties that surround the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. They're blighted because urban renewal, disinvestment, redlining. So there's that in the example at the top left. The top right is for anybody who likes to come and dig in the dirt. We host an annual something for International Archaeology Day during the month of October. And when we can, we do real archaeology on the properties supported by Hartman Archaeological Associates. Bottom right, just an example of the number of volunteers, I couldn't tell you how many over time, who have stepped up to the plate to help us to do so many things that have brought the Myers residence, the Myers residence campus, the story alive. And then bottom left is an example of a teen and preteen group. We got a few adults sprinkled in there, but we work with younger folks to bring the story to the community in a way that they choose to do. In this case, they're dressed up in costumes because this was a very sort of theatrically bent group, and they like to dress up in costume, and so they learned the history, they learned dances from the period, and they would take them out to public events. And then finally, this is the big new project.
Yeah, this is something we've been working on. We've kind of from our board meetings going way back to 2008, dreaming about a separate space that could enable us to do programming more effectively. And so a couple of years ago, we got a grant to help support the architectural work, and this is the building that resulted. We're in the process of working toward building that building, $10 to $12 million project. So if you have any loose change.
So if we can almost finish up with this. Just very quickly, for those of you who might be interested, these are the 4 images of a Dutch timber frame. They're just simply different angles. And the reason this is up here is because this interpretive center building, not only will it be a net zero building, but built into it is going to be the 1763 Dutch barn timber frame, which we have purchased from a farm in Montgomery County that was used on a farm that was worked on by people enslaved in New York State. And so it allows us to very tangibly, this will be placed in a very bold, prominent position in the main assembly hall, which will allow us to be able to tangibly talk about slavery in New York and in the country and its contemporary legacy, but also will allow us to talk about repurposing a piece of New York State's history to speak about emancipation and liberty. So in closing, let's just go back to the 8 principles. Can you go back? So in closing, we'd just like to bring these back forward to share with you that these are principles that we have found very helpful for what we call a new interpretation of a very old story. That yes, there are documents still out there waiting for us to find them and bring them forward. That the reality, the real story, is far more engaging than the mythical accounts that have grabbed hold of public memory. That there is a public side to this piece of the American narrative, and that the Underground Railroad is really best understood as a movement.
A resistance movement, and that the language we use is important, and it has a connection with us today. So thanks very much.
Yeah.
I think it's important to mention that we have a consortium now of how many Underground Railroad sites across New York that are connected together, so that it's not a lost thing anymore.
Right.
Look where you've gone all this time.
Another question over here?
Yeah.
This is for both groups of presenters. What are some of your strategies for telling somebody's story whom you don't have a lot about? We're telling more Black history stories at our site, and we have very limited scraps of information about some of those enslaved. We have a little bit more about free people during the Gilded Age, but it's like Dwight owns 1 acre of land. Robert is a freedom seeker from Brazil. So there's little bits we can pull out, but without making up, obviously,
Right.
a whole biography. What are strategies for telling?
Where are you from?
One of the things, what I would
Statsburg and Hudson Valley?
Statsburg.
what I would share, one of the things that we've sort of dealt with, oh, no,
No, I'm not.
one of the things that we've dealt with is when we only have limited amounts, what do we do with it? And one of the things that we do, again, like you say, not wanting to make up or embellish, but at the same time thinking about what little tidbit of information or tidbits that we have, and recognize that the person who's being referenced by these historic references is a human being, as all of us are. So how might we, for whatever is in the record, how might we, if we were that person, how might we respond to whatever the situation is? I'm not quite sure we're saying that very well.
Yeah, no,
But and also as examples, like we do with Harriet's letter, it's one piece, but for us it becomes a window into.
And sometimes grouping that person with other people who share the same story. Like we had a group of maybe like 10 or 15 names that have been gathered from different places. We have really very little information about them. Maybe a couple of names gathered from a letter that Stephen Myers had written, or maybe from another document, a citing in a newspaper maybe. But they all shared a broad story, even though we didn't know a lot about their specific stories.
I'll also
Yes.
share. Can I answer his question? Yeah. I'll also share, this comes up a lot in writing our curriculum materials, particularly when we're writing about enslaved people really early on in the colonial period. And so what we do a lot of the time is start with what biographical details we know, and then we're trying to write like the life stories we write. We're trying to write a narrative. And so we will at some point switch to like, here's what we know. Here's what we know about larger stories of enslaved women. Here are some of the historical possibilities that person may have experienced, and then pick up the story when we know the next beat of it. Does that make sense?
And Judy, you were going to offer to?
Just to really, this is fabulous, and these people are fabulous, and you all have to go. There are people across the state looking for your own local areas. One of the best sources is to look in the census records, like 1850, 55, and 60. Don't use Ancestry.com because they actually did not record a lot of black names. Go to you can use it, but use the original census and go read the whole thing. But also newspapers, there's so much online, and as soon as they knew people were free, these freedom seekers became one of the best recruitment places for other people, and they just put their stories in the newspaper. And African American newspapers and accessible archives, if you're not used to that, is really good, and it's through the state library or any local library or any university library. They're really good. And then the other really good source, and students can do this. I mean, wherever you are, put your name in, put Underground Railroad and see what comes up. And the other big source that's easily accessible is the Doc South at the University of North Carolina. DocSouth.unc.edu, and it's really quick. And just put in the name of your place and see what comes up.
Yeah, Doc South is wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned earlier the risks associated with helping any kind of freedom seeker. Were those risks any kind of punishments? Were they dependent on race or gender, or were they kind of just a widespread similar punishment for anyone?
Well, it was meant to be a widespread similar punishment for anyone, but I think race and gender and geography all played a role. For instance, we like to think about the stories that we're familiar with in New York State, where there were confrontations, in Troy, Charles Knoll, the story, or in Syracuse, William Henry, yeah. So, but in Albany, we didn't seem to have those kinds of stories, and we're looking at particularly the story of Stephen and Harriet Myers, and we recognize the fact that unlike in these other situations, as far as we could tell, Stephen Myers in particular was well knitted into the community. He had probably, as a young person, interacted with a lot of the people that later became judges and politicians and in the community. And so although he did not occupy that kind of a space, he knew those people. They were, you know, from his childhood. And then later on, well, anyway, yeah. So that familiarity, and later on, he worked as a butler in many of their homes. So again,
The other thing
different kind of
the other thing I often reference is what I claim to be something of a buffer around particularly Stephen Myers, but Stephen and Harriet together, because there was a local Albany philanthropist by the name of Thurlow Weed who managed the Albany Evening Journal, he owned the Albany Evening Journal newspaper, and there was certainly the Jay family providing financial support. Thurlow Weed provided financial support, sometimes assisted with freedom seekers through Stephen Myers, and there are three philanthropists we identified in New York City. Their names escape me at the moment, but what the result is that there are these
well-positioned,
thank you.
power support.
Yeah, both up here and down in the city, that could have made prosecution of Stephen Myers and Harriet Myers for the work they were doing rather difficult to pursue. So, anything else, Purple Lady? Anything at all? Yes?
I just want to thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for mentioning Shinnecock, because very often, you know, we're providing a lot about, even people who travel Long Island regularly, they just pass us by and don't know that we exist. So thank you for that. I was just wondering, do you connect with the communities that you're speaking about in the curriculum? And do you have Native people on whatever board or whatever committees?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing process. We're working, so I mentioned we were doing work last week. We're working with members of the Algonquin Nation to create a series of videos about wampum and its meaning and how it's been used. We contacted Montaukett folks when we were writing the Quashbum life story. That one was particularly challenging. We really wanted to tell that story because it's such an example of like self-actualization and self-motivation, and in a way that isn't often represented. Like, you get a lot of conversion stories, or you get a lot of, we didn't get to link them today, but you get a lot of warrior stories. But the story of a woman who's like, I'm just gonna play this political game and see what I can do, like, that felt really wonderful to tell. So we were in touch with the Montaukett Nation. They shared what resources that they had, but we are always looking for more connections. So if you have anyone who should be in touch with, I would love to know more.
Thank you for.
Thank you.